Paper was like gold in medieval times.
Oh, not tobacco, sugar.
That everything we thought we knew about the world might turn out to be completely wrong.
I have stood in battle, where balls like hail were flying all around me. The man standing next to me was shot by my side. His blood spotted upon my clothes, which I wore for weeks. My nearest blood, except that which runs in my vein, was shed for liberty. Liberty is dear to my heart. I cannot endure the thought that my countrymen should be slaves. Revolutionary War veteran Samuel Harris.
Hello, I'm Colin Powell, and I was an American soldier for 35 years. I was a black American soldier, and I followed in a long tradition of black men and women who have served this nation since long before our Revolutionary War. For so many years, they served their nation without their nation ever serving them. They served because they believed in this nation. They believed in the promise of our democracy. They believed in what the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution said. But for so many years, they were denied the rights and the privileges that other Americans enjoyed. Their story isn't well known. Their story was suppressed. Historians did not write about it well enough. But there's a wonderful story. It is a story of a group of Americans who never lost their love of this country, never lost their faith in what the Founding Fathers had promised. And that's why this story is simply called For Love of Liberty.
To the war has gone. In the ranks of death, you find him. His father's soul has girded on, and his wild heart son behind him. Shall serve you, the soul of love and bravery. The songs were made for the pure and free. They shall never sound in slavery. Never again.
The record of this nation's African-American servicemen and women is a heroic story draped in irony. Why, despite enormous injustice, did these determined individuals fight so valiantly for freedoms they themselves did not enjoy? The answer to this question can be found in the letters, diaries, thoughts, and reflections of those who were there. Their words are relevant to every American and speak of courage, honor, duty, and sacrifice for love of liberty. I'm Halle Berry, and this is their story.
Previously on For Love of Liberty. The first man to die in the cause that would become the American Revolution was black. Crispus Attucks and others like him made the ultimate sacrifice to ensure that their people would one day enjoy the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 4 generations later, most African Americans were still slaves. Yet black men were willing to fight and die to save a nation that wouldn't even allow them the right to vote. As the country grew west, Buffalo soldiers were there to keep the peace, and at the Battle of San Juan Hill, Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders owed their lives to the men of the 10th Cavalry. In the war to end all wars, members of the Harlem Hellfighters became the first American troops, black or white, to receive the French Medal of Honor. Yet, a white naval officer refused to allow black combat veterans to board his ship. In America, racism was rampant. And during World War II, life in the United States military was not much different. When the Second World War began, if you were black and serving in the Navy, regulations prohibited you from General Sea duty. In the summer of 1944, the Secretary of the Navy, Admiral Ernest King, said, "Enough."
You know, we say that we are a democracy. Well, a democracy ought to have a democratic Navy. Admiral Ernest King.
On a bitterly cold day in Boston, the Navy commissioned the USS Mason. The destroyer escort was the first warship to contain a predominantly black crew. The men served with distinction, battling German U-boats and weather as they guided a slow-moving Allied convoy across the Atlantic.
Each day was a new adventure, and it was a scary one. We were in hurricane weather for 31 days. We were looking at seas that were 40 to 50 feet high. Ships were lost. Lives of people were lost. We would discuss these things at chow, wondering if the next day was going to bring us the same kind of fate. Merwin Peters, USS Mason.
As American destroyers patrolled the Atlantic, a convoy of a different sort was crossing the English Channel. It was the largest invasion fleet in the history of the world. Aboard, the men of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion prepared for the liberation of Europe. When the men landed on Omaha and Utah beaches, D-Day, June 6, 1944, they became the first black soldiers to see combat in the European theater. Their mission was to prevent the Luftwaffe from strafing the invasion force by launching huge dirigibles. The Army's official newspaper, Stars and Stripes, would later report on their efforts.
A U.S. beachhead, July 5, 1944. During and since D-Day, barrage balloons flown by a Negro Barrage Balloon Battalion have provided a screen of rubber several miles long on the two main beachheads. The unit has the distinction of being the only Negro combat group included in the first assault forces to hit the coast.
America lost some 6,600 men during the Normandy invasion, including members of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion who died in the initial assault. Years later, Tech Sergeant George Davison recalled the events of that day.
You won't read too much about what black soldiers did on D-Day, but we were there. Sure, I was scared. We all were. But it was something we had to do. No soldiers were killed on the beach by Nazi fighters that day. And by the next, the skies belonged to the Allies. Tech Sergeant George Davison.
In August of 1944, the Buffalo Soldiers arrived in Italy. Ulysses Lee, the official government historian for the employment of Negro troops during World War II, was there.
As the thousands of black fighting men debarked from the crowded troop ships, they presented an impressive and awe-inspiring spectacle. Armed with basic weapons and full-field battle dress, proudly wearing the circular shoulder patch with the black buffalo, they moved smartly and efficiently into their unit formations. As they marched away, every man in step, every weapon in place, chins up and eyes forward, A low, rumbling babble of sound came from the troops on the dock, then swelled to a crescendo of thunderous cheering, which continued until the last Buffalo unit had disappeared from sight. Ulysses Lee.
The unit's white commander, General Edward Almond, didn't want them in.
I did not send for you. Your Negro newspapers, Negro politicians, and white friends have insisted on your seeing combat. And I shall see to it that you get combat and your share of casualties. General Edmund Almond.
The 92nd Infantry battled some of Germany's best trained troops as they fought their way through Italy. In letters home, soldiers like 2nd Lieutenant Spencer Moore would write of their combat experiences.
Dear Mom and Pop, we've been on the line for 82 days, and I don't know when we're gonna get relieved. The men are lousy, sick, frostbitten, shell-shocked, and scared. It's no joke to see men you've known, lived with, eaten with, and slept with blown up or shot down before your eyes. Well, Mom, Jerry's being in a shell again, so I'll sign off for now. Your loving son, Spencer.
The day after Christmas, 2 platoons of Buffalo soldiers awoke to the sound of mortar fire. The area was swarming with Nazi troops, and within a few hours, the men were fighting for their lives. Nearby, Lieutenant John Fox was calling in artillery coordinates so that others could escape. As the shells moved closer and closer to his position, the officer in charge, Major Otis Zachary, who was also one of his best friends, refused to fire. The Germans were closing in. Lieutenant Fox radioed back.
Fire it.
No one survived who saw what happened next. But after the battle, a local priest reported seeing the body of John Fox surrounded by more than 100 dead enemy soldiers. Of the 95 American and Italian defenders, 18 made it back alive.
It was rough, but we were dedicated. We were fighting for a greater cause, for our people. We had to defeat them, and we had to prove that blacks would fight. If we failed, the whole black race would fail. We were fighting for the flag and for our rights. Sergeant James Tillman.
The Marine Corps' all-black 51st Heavy Defense Battalion was known as a hotshot shooting outfit. When they were ordered to the Pacific, their train stopped in Atlanta. The local sheriff refused to let them off.
I'll be home for Christmas.
I don't give a good goddamn if them niggers is going to Tokyo.
You can plan on me.
They ain't going to eat in Atlanta, Georgia with white folks.
Please have snow and mistletoe.
While passing through Louisiana, 9 black Marines traveling in uniform were refused service in the local cafes.
Christmas Eve will
As the men ate in the back room of a railroad station kitchen, they watched 24 German prisoners of war and their white American guards enter the lunchroom and take seats in the front. Corporal Robert Trimmingham wrote a furious letter to Yank magazine.
What is the Negro soldier fighting for? On whose team are we playing?
Well, the Lord is my shepherd.
I stood outside looking in and could not help to ask myself these questions. Are these men sworn enemies of this country? Are we not American soldiers sworn to fight for and die, if need be, for this, our country? Then why are the Germans treated better than we are? Why does the government allow such things to go on? Corporal Robert Trimmingham.
In the Pacific, African-American soldiers listened as Japanese radio propaganda made the most of those incidents.
There was this lady, Tokyo Rose. She would come on every morning and ask us, "Why are you fighting us? In your own country, you cannot go to a restaurant. You are being lynched in the South. We are your friends. We are not your enemies. We don't want to kill you. We want to kill the whites. They're the ones who are mistreating you."
I'll see you.
Marine Private Frederick Gray.
In my dreams.
South Pacific Island beaches were some of the most dangerous terrain in the world. Following a major landing, black combat units would be called in for mopping up operations. In a letter to his mom, Nelson Peary described their work.
Our job has been to hold the island of Halmahera, which is 12 miles from here and crawling with 37,000 Japanese soldiers. Their job is to retake the island. Sometimes their suicide units would break through and off we go again. Really nasty business hunting them down like dogs and killing them. We learned to live with the hordes of mosquitoes and green flies. Fat from the corpses that still lay half-rotted, covered by mud and slime. Nelson Peary.
Once the islands were secured, thousands of African-American soldiers, Marines, and sailors built roads, harbors, and airfields.
We would stay on an island for a while, then move on. We were going up the Slot, the Solomon Islands. We would land on them and the engineers would come in and clear a path for an airstrip. We'd land on another island, establish a base, and then move on. Bypass some and move. Get another island and build another airstrip. Howard Hickerson, 93rd Infantry.
Early in the war, the Army had announced the formation of the 1st Black Air Corps, the 99th Pursuit Squadron. Based in Tuskegee, Alabama, the unit was listed as experimental.
They said we didn't have the intelligence, the demeanor, the courage to be combat pilots. They learned differently. All we needed was a chance and training. First Lieutenant Charles Chuck McGee.
When the Tuskegee Airmen finally arrived in Europe, they were under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. He was the first black officer to solo an Army Air Corps aircraft and the son of the Army's first black general, Benjamin O. Davis, Sr.
I do not believe we are going to let color stop us from winning this war. Brigadier General Benjamin O. Davis.
While escorting a squadron of bombers over Sicily, Charlie Buster Hall became the first African-American pilot in World War II to shoot down an enemy aircraft. Louis Purnell, a member of the squadron, remembered the victory celebration.
Although Hall was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, his most appreciated prize may well have been an ice-cold bottle of Coca-Cola.
Purnell had obtained a single bottle during a stopover in Tunis. When he landed back at the base, the soft drink was locked in the squadron safe.
The day of Charlie's victory, we obtained a block of ice from a town that was 15 miles from our base. We chilled a bottle of Coke in a 1-gallon fruit juice can packed with ice. It was in the shade of a grove of olive trees that the bottle of Coke probably the only one in the Mediterranean theater of operations, came to a well-deserved end. Second Lieutenant Louis Purnell.
The Tuskegee Airmen quickly earned the admiration of friend and foe alike. The German Luftwaffe called them Schwarze Wolkemenschen, Black Birdmen. To American bomber crews, they were known as Red Tail Angels because of the red stabilizers on their P-51 Mustangs and their reputation at that time for having never lost a single bomber they escorted into combat.
We got the reddest paint we could find and painted our aircraft. We wanted the bomber crews to know when we were escorting them, and we wanted to make sure the Luftwaffe knew when we were airborne and in their territory. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Carter.
One B-24 crewman recalled,
"Ordinary guys did a certain precision rollover to show you they were friendly, but the red tails would roll that wing over and over and float through the formation like dancers. When you saw them, you were happy. They were that hot, that good." Tech Sergeant John Red Connell.
By early 1944, the unit was flying 36 to 48 sorties a day. One hot summer afternoon, Captain Wendell Pruitt and Lieutenant Gwen Pearson sank a German destroyer in Trieste Harbor using only their machine guns.
Pruitt was on my left. Tracers showed my first burst was falling far short, kicking up nothing but water. The next burst struck at the ship's waterline and started to walk up the side. I pulled back on my control stick and climbed just enough to clear the smoke as the ship rolled over and sank in the waves. Lieutenant Gwen Pearson.
By the time the war ended, the Red Tails had downed 111 enemy aircraft, destroyed 150 other planes on the ground, and flown over 15,000 combat sorties. 66 Tuskegee Airmen lost their lives.
We proved that the antidote to racism is excellence in performance. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Carter.
The worst Homefront disaster of the war took place at Port Chicago, California. Late one night, 2 Navy munitions ships exploded, killing 320 men, including 202 black ammunition loaders. Seaman Freddie Meeks recalled the disaster.
There weren't any bodies, just pieces of flesh they shoveled up.
Despite the carnage, sailors were ordered to resume loading less than 3 weeks later. 258 men, believing that the conditions were unsafe, refused to comply.
I am willing to be governed by the laws of the Navy and will do anything to help my country win this war. I will go to the front if necessary, but I am afraid to load ammunition. Freddie Meeks.
The men were promptly arrested. 50 of them were charged with mutiny and eventually convicted. NAACP attorney Thurgood Marshall was outraged.
This is not 50 men on trial for mutiny. This is the Navy on trial for its whole vicious policy toward Negroes. Negroes in the Navy don't mind loading ammunition. They just want to know why they're the only ones doing the loading. Thurgood Marshall.
For many Negro ammunition loaders, the only place more dangerous than Port Chicago was an aircraft carrier at sea. James Hairston was a steward aboard the USS Hornet.
Whenever we got in battle,
I had to go 6 stories underneath the water level and load the bombs into an elevator that sent them into the hangar deck. Every time you went down a level, they closed the hatch behind you and locked it. Once you went down there, you had no idea what was happening above. The only sounds were the bombs hitting the water as they got closer to the ship. The louder the boom, the more you knew things were not going well. If you got hit, the compartment would get flooded, and you had to hope someone would come and open the hatch. But the Navy wouldn't sacrifice the lives of 3,000 men above deck to save the lives of 20 or so guys down there. So a lot of times, those guys got left behind. Stewart James Harrison.
Back in France, General George Patton's bold armored advance had stretched his supply lines to near collapse. To solve the problem, the Army Transportation Corps created a huge trucking operation called the Red Ball Express. Most of its drivers were black. James Rookard was one of them.
When General Patton said for you to be there, you were there if you had to drive all day and all night. Those trucks just kept running. They'd break down and we'd fix them, and they'd run again. James Rookard.
On an average day, 900 fully loaded vehicles were on the Red Ball route, around the clock.
We had to drive slowly at night because you could hardly see. If you turned on your headlights, the Germans could bomb the whole convoy. So we had to feel our way down the road. Sure, I was scared, but I did my job. James Rookard.
By late October 1944, General Patton's Third Army was in desperate need of reinforcements. The only combat armored units left were black. Despite his personal lack of faith in the inherent fighting ability of African Americans, the general chose the 761st Tank Battalion. The soldiers were nicknamed the Black Panthers. Welcoming them to Normandy, he said,
"Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are so long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Don't let them down. And damn you, don't let me down." General George S. Patton.
Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was one of the black tankers who heard the general's speech. His unit's motto was, "Come out fighting." The fearless young soldier from Oklahoma was a legend in the battalion. When he was ordered to retreat from a heavily defended German town, the heroic tanker replied,
"I'm sorry, sir. I'm already through that town."
Rivers led the way, became a byword for bravery. On November 16th, his tank hit a mine. When the medics arrived, they found Sergeant Rivers with a bone sticking out of his leg. He turned down morphine, then refused to be evacuated, telling his commanding officer, "You need me." 3 days later, with his leg badly infected, Rivers' unit emerged from cover and began an assault on Nazi troops holed up in the French village of Bougeltrop. Ignoring a hailstorm of German tracer bullets, Rivers attacked, allowing his trapped comrades to escape. His captain ordered him to withdraw.
"Move back, Rivers."
The rest of the Black Panthers could hear their brother in arms on the radio.
"I see them. We'll fight."
Rivers kept firing until tracers were seen entering his turret.
"Pull up, driver. Pull back, driver." "Oh, Lord."
The tank exploded. Sergeant Rivers' final act of heroism had cost him his life. His commanding officer, Captain David Williams, later commented,
"Nobody surpassed Rivers' feat. He was seriously wounded. I begged him to be evacuated. I told him, hey, this is your chance. Your war is over." But he insisted on fighting. And you know why? Out there, it's not for country and Coca-Cola. Out there, it's for each other. He said, "You need me." And he was right. We did need him. Only he got killed. Captain David Williams.
The Black Panthers would go on to participate in the Battle of the Bulge and help to punch through the Siegfried Line. VE Day would find them in Austria, where they, like the Harlem Hellfighters of World War I, had become the easternmost unit of all the Western Allied forces in Europe. For their actions, they were presented with the highest combat award a military unit can receive, a Presidential Unit Citation. It was bestowed 33 years later by President Jimmy Carter. Their commanding officer would say of his men,
"These guys were better than heroes because they weren't supposed to be able to fight. And they were treated worse than lepers. It took a rare sort of character to go out there and do what they did." I used to ask myself, why the hell should these guys fight? Why? Captain David Williams.
The Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest battle American soldiers would fight in Europe during World War II. It began on December 16, 1944, when the Germans launched a massive counteroffensive that caught the Allies completely by surprise. Most of the 81,000 American casualties occurred in the first 3 days. Desperately needing reinforcements, General Eisenhower agreed to allow black service troops to enter all-white combat units fighting on the front lines. Of the 5,000 or so African Americans who volunteered, 2,221 were selected. There was, however, a catch. Due in part to their lack of combat experience and systemic racial prejudice, the men were required to surrender whatever rank they had previously earned in military service. Their efforts helped to turn the tide in Europe. In a letter home, John Stevens wrote,
"Well, I don't know what day it is because we have been so busy fighting we have forgotten about day and time. A lot of my buddies have been killed here, but through the help of God, I'm still here. We have taken a beating, but these guys are still pitching. Whoever said the colored soldier can't fight is a damn liar. These guys in the infantry told us they'd rather have us with them than the white soldiers. We should pray to God in heaven because we are going through hell here." John Stevens.
As African-American soldiers fought their way through Europe, in the Pacific, African-American Marines were fighting in one of the deadliest battles of the war, Iwo Jima. Sergeant Jim Rundles was there.
On the dawn of the invasion, February 19th, 1945, I remember we all gathered at the side of the ship, watching the huge 16-inch guns of the battleships pound Iwo with shell after shell. It seemed the whole island was covered in smoke. Good Lord, I thought. Nothing can survive that. Sergeant Jim Rundles.
Iwo Jima was a critical link in the United States' quest to construct a chain of airstrips across the Pacific. Allied planes needed the island as an emergency runway for their bombing missions over Japan. When the Marines landed, 22,000 Japanese soldiers were waiting for them.
The Japanese suddenly opened up with a barrage of shells from 16-inch guns they had taken from ships and placed in the side of Mount Suribachi. The Marines had no place to run. Nearly 2,000 were killed the first day. Inch by inch, they moved ahead, but the deadly barrage never stopped.
Black Marines of the 8th Ammunition Company landed in the early stages of the battle.
They somehow made it to some cover behind the jutting end of a cliff that leaned out toward the ocean. The Japanese were trying hard to knock them out because if they could blow up the ammunition dump, the Marines would, in fairly short order, run out of ammunition.
Much of the ammo was delivered aboard amphibious transport vehicles called ducks. At their helm were Montford Point Marines.
One of the bravest sights I'd seen was the black driver of a duck. Time and time again, he delivered much-needed ammunition to Marines fighting at the foot of Suribachi. This Japanese shot 2 trucks out from under him, but he came back every time.
On D-Day +4, it was Sergeant Jim Rundle's turn. He boarded an LST and made for the shore.
As we headed toward the beach, I glanced up and pointed my field glasses towards Suribachi. And there she went. They were raising a flag. God, what a beautiful sight, I thought. Sergeant Jim Rundles.
The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days. When it was over, virtually every single Japanese soldier had been killed, and 6,825 American GIs had lost their lives. When the island was finally secured, Captain Robert Johnson said,
"This is the most expensive piece of real estate the United States has ever purchased. We paid 550 lives, 2,500 wounded for every square mile."
In Europe, on April 11, 1945, the American Army entered the Buchenwald concentration camp.
The most moving moment of my life is the day that the Americans arrived. It was the morning of April 11th. I'll always remember with love. A big black soldier, he was crying like a child. Tears of all the pain in the world and all the rage. Everyone who was there that day will forever feel a sentiment of gratitude to the American soldiers who liberated us. Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel.
Sergeant William Scott was an Army photographer who arrived at the camp the next day.
We got out of our vehicles and some began to beckon to us to follow and see what had been done in that place. They were walking skeletons. The sights were beyond description. I had thought no place could be this bad. I took out my camera and began to take some photos, but that only lasted for a few pictures. As the scenes became more gruesome, I put my camera in its case and walked in a daze with the survivors as we viewed all forms of dismemberment of the human body. Sergeant William Scott.
3.5 weeks later, Adolf Hitler was dead and the war in Europe was over. Like everyone else, the Buffalo Soldiers looked forward to returning to their families.
Dear Mom and Pop, I can hardly remember what it's like in the States. You will be surprised at what a numb feeling I have. Won't be long before we're back at home. That will be Victory at Home Day for all of us. Love, Spencer.
Victory in the Pacific would come 4 months later.
We were very happy about the use of the atomic bomb because we were told that we would be in on the invasion of Japan, and they expected 2 million casualties for us. Since we did not start the war, I would rather they be killed than us. Donald McNeil.
As America's black servicemen and women returned home, they rediscovered a country where little had changed.
We landed in Norfolk, Virginia. We were all Buffalo soldiers, and they didn't want us to go through town. They said it would cause too much traffic, but I knew it was because we were black. Later on, I saw how people celebrated elsewhere, but not in Virginia, not for us. The few black people we saw looked scared. Sergeant James Tillman.
As in the past, the end of the war brought forth a rash of racial atrocities. In Monroe, Georgia, on July 25th, 1946, 4 young black people, 2 men and their wives, one of whom was pregnant, were dragged from a car by a white mob, beaten, then taken into the woods and shot to death by a firing squad. One of the men was George Dorsey, a World War II veteran that some of the townspeople had accused of being uppity.
The Negro troops got a taste of racial equality in foreign lands. As it came home, it had to be beaten and lynched and terrorized out of them before they could go back to picking cotton. World War II veteran Nelson Peary.
The unsolved murders led to a national outcry, and George Dorsey's status as a thrice-decorated war veteran prompted President Harry Truman to push for sweeping civil rights changes.
It is my deep conviction that we have reached a turning point in the long history of our country's efforts to guarantee freedom and equality. Recent events in the United States and abroad have made us realize that it is more important today than ever before to ensure that all Americans enjoy these rights. We must and shall guarantee the civil rights of all our citizens.
In July of 1948, the President issued Executive Order 9981, which would ultimately desegregate the United States military.
It's hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services, without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. President Harry Truman.
It would take 3 more years and another war before President Truman's orders were carried out.
On June 24th, 1950, North Korean troops invaded South Korea and quickly captured the city of Seoul. 1 month later, the Buffalo Soldiers, accompanied by 3 other black combat units, were among the first to arrive on Korean soil. As in conflicts past, these African-American soldiers would be the war's first heroes.
If the best minds in the world had set out to find us the worst possible location to fight this damnable war, politically and militarily, the unanimous choice would have been Korea. Secretary of State Dean Acheson.
The initial invasion of Korea did not go well. Ill-equipped and outgunned, American soldiers were forced to use tanks as artillery pieces. The segregated American units, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, were engaged in grim defensive battles. the troops were often outnumbered by 3 and 4 to 1. 10 days after landing in Busan, African-American units were ordered to recapture the town of Yechon.
I will remember Yechon for another 100 years. Even in my nightmares, I've never seen carnage, death, and destruction to equal, even to approach that of 20 July 1950. Captain Charles Busey.
The 2-day battle was an important victory for a nation in desperate need of hope. That black soldiers had achieved it was even better, because it helped refute communist propaganda that the American effort in Korea was an attack by whites on Asian people of color. Back in Washington, the Congressional Record declared,
"First United States victory in Korea won by Negro GIs."
A week and a half later, Private William Thompson's company was attacked by North Korean troops. Disregarding an order to withdraw, the 22-year-old soldier grabbed a machine gun and provided covering fire, which permitted most of his unit to escape with their lives. President Harry Truman would later tell this story to the entire nation.
Although hit repeatedly by grenade fragments and small arms fire, he resisted all efforts of his comrades to induce him to withdraw. Steadfastly remained at his machine gun and continued to deliver deadly accurate fire until mortally wounded by an enemy grenade. President Harry Truman.
William Thompson would become the first African-American patriot to receive the Medal of Honor since the Spanish-American War. At his funeral, one of America's most distinguished civil rights leaders, the Reverend C.L. Franklin, spoke of the soldiers' humble beginnings at the Bronx Center for Homeless Boys.
He was not a West Point man or a college graduate, but at the hour of need, heard the cry of his country and gave all he had. Reverend C.L. Franklin.
Air-to-ground combat came into its own in Korea. The weapon of choice was the P-51 Mustang. Piloted by men like Daniel Chappie James, the aircraft provided infantry support with bombs and bullets, napalm and rockets. Like most young fighter pilots in his unit, Chappie would fly 5 to 8 missions a day. His job was to cruise at treetop level, strafing trains, supply lines, and North Korean tanks and soldiers. In one such battle, he flew so low that he was able to attack hundreds of enemy troops operating just a few yards in front of the American forces. Chappie's skill as a pilot saved the lives of countless American soldiers.
Over a few beers, I've even had white guys say they like me. They've seen me roll in on that target when the flak was heavy just like they did and come scooting out on the other side. Daniel Chappie James.
Chappie was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and would later become one of the first pilots to fly a fighter jet. While in the cockpit of one of the new F-80s, the North Koreans finally knocked him out of the sky.
When the big stuff hits you, it's like being slugged. You can no longer hold on to your mount or get it to do your bidding. Damned if a Marine tank crew didn't pick me up and rescue me.
Daniel Chappie James would later become America's first black 4-star general.
I am an American. My heritage is bound by the tenets of freedom inherent in that simple statement. Daniel Chappie James.
3,603 American soldiers were killed in action on the Pusan perimeter between August 4th and September 16th. Anxious to stop the bleeding, General MacArthur staged one of the most celebrated events in his military career and ordered the daring amphibious landing behind enemy lines at Incheon. Seoul was liberated shortly thereafter. With the victory, America's military objectives changed, and the United States decided to unite the country under South Korean leadership. In late September, the President authorized General MacArthur to conduct military operations north of Korea's 38th parallel. However, he also instructed the general to use only South Korean ground troops in provinces bordering China and the USSR. To gain a better understanding of the situation, the president then flew to Wake Island in order to meet with his Far East commander in person. General MacArthur assured him that Chinese intervention was unlikely and that American troops would be home by Christmas.
I thought we had won the war, and we went north with high hopes. There was a rumor that the first troops to the Yalu River were the first troops to go home. We never got to that river, and a lot of us never got home. Captain Charles Busey.
What General MacArthur didn't know was that China had moved some 250,000 troops into the mountains of North Korea. As Thanksgiving approached, the Americans found themselves hunkered down in freezing conditions, facing an army of highly disciplined Chinese soldiers.
Up and down the river valley, all hell had broken loose. Traces, explosions left and right. The Chinese blew bugles and whistles and shouted American profanities. Between shots and explosions, I could hear the wounded crying for help. Artilleryman James Marks.
When it was over, the Chinese had killed more than 1,600 Americans and precipitated the largest retreat in U.S. Army history.
It was a disaster, and it was a leaderless disaster. We ran headlong, helter-skelter, pell-mell, trying to get to Pusan, trying to get back to Japan. It was disgusting. I never felt so inadequate in my life as to be part of an army that was running. I used to have nightmares. I could feel 10,000 Chinese walking over my chest. Captain Charles Busey.
MacArthur's calls to widen the conflict by attacking the Chinese directly infuriated the president. And in April of 1951, the general was dismissed.
General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders, but the cause of world peace is more important than any individual. President Harry Truman.
MacArthur's replacement was General Matthew Ridgway, who had strong opinions when it came to segregated troops.
It has always seemed to me to be un-American and un-Christian for free citizens to be taught to downgrade themselves in this way, as if they were unfit to associate with their fellows or to accept leadership themselves. General Matthew Ridgway.
In the spring of 1951, the general formally asked permission to implement the president's 1948 executive order, which called for the integration of the American military.
It was my conviction that only in this way could we assure the sort of esprit that a fighting army needs, where each soldier stands proudly on his own feet, knowing himself to be as good as the next fellow and better than the enemy. Matthew Ridgway.
The Army agreed. For the first time in its history, the United States military was integrated. Some of the units were under the command of black officers.
My job was being a combat officer. The
The white soldiers had no hang-ups about being with me because they realized they had to follow me if they wanted to get out alive. Lieutenant Charles Armstrong.
One of the most intense artillery bombardments of the Korean War was directed at Hill 983. The soldiers called it Bloody Ridge. And Lieutenant Charles Armstrong was ordered to capture it.
When I told my men that we were going to take the hill that night, they cried. They told me that we were all dead. They said, "Look at what's happening to the other soldiers that are going up there." I told them, "That's not us." Napalm bombs, grenades, and mortars exploded all around us as we marched up that rugged, barren hill. We stayed close together and didn't lose a single soldier. Lieutenant Charles Armstrong.
It was at the Battle of Chipori that Sergeant Cornelius Charlton became the Korean War's second Black Medal of Honor recipient. Weeks earlier, he had asked to be relieved of his administrative duties so that he could go to the front and fight. He told his commanding officer,
"I just don't feel right sitting here while others are doing the fighting up north." Sergeant Cornelius Charlton.
He got his wish on June the 2nd, 1951, when he was ordered to attack a heavily defended hostile fortification. When the unit's platoon leader was badly wounded, Sergeant Charlton took charge, rallied the troops, and initiated 3 separate attacks. After suffering a serious chest wound, he refused medical attention. Holding his injuries with one hand and his rifle in the other, Cornelius Charlton charged into the firefight, bleeding from more than a dozen wounds. Blasting away, he continued his direct frontal assault until an enemy grenade brought him down. He died quietly next to the bunker he had just destroyed. At his funeral in West Virginia, the soldier's father was heard to say,
"The death of my boy distinctly makes a liar out of those who have said the Negro will not fight for our country. Those who have felt that the Negro is a second-class citizen must know in their hearts that this isn't so." Mr. Van Charlton.
That same year, on Christmas night in a small Florida town, NAACP activist Harry Moore, a tireless organizer for Negro rights that some had called the most hated black man in Florida, and his wife Harriet kissed their children goodnight and crawled into bed.
Holy night, the stars are brightly shining. It is the night.
As they drifted off to sleep, a bomb that had been placed beneath their bedroom by the Ku Klux Klan exploded and blew them both to the roof of their tiny cottage.
It could not be in Jesus' name beneath the bedroom floor. On Christmas night, the killers hid the bomb for Harry Moore. It could not be in Jesus' name. The killers took his life, blew his home to pieces, and killed his faithful wife.
When Christ was born,
It seems that I hear Harry Moore. From the earth his voice still cries, "No bomb can kill the dreams I hold, for freedom never dies. I will not stop, I will not stop, for freedom never dies. I will not stop, I will not stop, for freedom never dies." Poet Langston Hughes.
Shortly after Dwight Eisenhower assumed the presidency in 1953, the shooting stopped in Korea and started in Vietnam. A year later, the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu fell to the communists, and in Washington, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional. Both events would shake the United States to its very core.
I would never fight on a foreign shore for America again. Black people should not be called on to assume the duties of citizenship when they don't enjoy the rights and privileges. A lot of black soldiers have been brainwashed. But when they come back and they see what they fight for doesn't mean a thing, and they are still considered niggas, well then, a lot of things are gonna happen. It all depends on how much combat fatigue they have. Radio operator David Tuck.
The war in Vietnam was the first truly integrated war ever fought by the United States. For the first time, black and white, men and women fought side by side from the very beginning. Captain Colin Powell arrived in Saigon on Christmas morning in 1962. His first combat mission was Operation Grasshopper. In the pre-dawn hours of February 7th, his battalion moved out. He would later write,
"Soon the long green line of troops was swallowed up by the dark jungle. I felt a tingling anticipation. A force of armed men moving into the unknown has certain power, even a touch of majesty." Captain Colin Powell.
By the sixth day, following an attack that killed one man and wounded another, the young officer found that his battle exhilaration had disappeared.
Somebody got killed today. Somebody was liable to get killed tomorrow, the day after. This was not war movies on a Saturday afternoon. It was real. It was ugly. Captain Colin Powell.
In the spring of 1965, the first official U.S. combat troops arrived on the shores of Vietnam. Lines of solemn-faced young soldiers, black and white, could be seen marching by the hundreds as they were greeted by smiling Vietnamese women. In Selma, Alabama, Martin Luther King's supporters were also marching to Montgomery. On both fronts, the worst was yet to come. That summer, 34 people would die in the Watts riots, and almost 400 American troops would perish in the jungles of Southeast Asia. On October 22nd of that year, just 2 weeks shy of his 19th birthday, Private First Class Milton Olive was on a search and destroy patrol when the Viet Cong attacked with hand grenades. One landed in the midst of his platoon. The young GI threw himself over it and was killed, saving the lives of 4 soldiers he hardly knew. Private Milton Olive would become the first African American to receive the Medal of Honor in Vietnam.
In dying, Private Milton Olive taught those of us who remain how we ought to live. President Lyndon Johnson.
3 weeks later, the first large-scale confrontation of the war occurred at Ia Drang Valley. Colonel Harold Moore was there.
America had drifted slowly but inexorably into war in this far-off place. Until now, the dying on our side at least had been by ones and twos. Now the dying began in earnest. My battalion had come looking for trouble in the Ia Drang. We found all we wanted, and more. Harold Moore.
Iwo Jima was an enemy sanctuary so deep in the jungle that it was considered virtually impenetrable to American foot soldiers. All of that changed when 28 officers and 429 men of the 1st Air Cavalry landed their helicopters in the midst of 3,000 North Vietnamese troops hiding there. Within hours, the men were fighting for their lives.
The dead was everywhere. Only God knows who the body parts belonged to. Some suffered through the night and survived, but others lay dead in the elephant grass. Everywhere you walked, there was blood. So much blood. For the first time since I was a boy, I cried. Sergeant Freddie Owens.
Calvin Bachknight, a black medic and conscientious objector who refused to carry a weapon, was using his own body to shield 2 badly wounded comrades when he was shot in the back. In his last letter to his parents, he had written,
"We're going into the field tomorrow. We're so short of medics. I don't really mind. And strangely, I'm not afraid. Where we're going, quite a few have died. Love, Calvin."
His commanding officer later declared,
"The scriptures say there is no greater love than to lay down your life for your friends." This is what Calvin did in that fire-filled jungle. Colonel Harold Moore.
As the survivors prepared to evacuate, the North Vietnamese army attacked again.
Men began to fall all around me as snipers picked them off like flies. There was no place to hide in the grass as the rifle and mortar fire intensified and engulfed the entire column. Everywhere you looked, someone was wounded or dead. Never did I expect to see bodies of the NVA and American soldiers so close together. Blood saturated the ground as men were crying for help. The NVA mutilated the wounded we could not reach. Sergeant Freddie Owens.
234 Americans died at Iwo Jima. Enemy casualties were put at 2,000. Colonel Harold Moore would later write,
John F. Kennedy waited for us on a hill in Arlington National Cemetery. And in time, we came by the thousands to fill in those slopes with our white marble markers, then to ask on the murmur of the wind if this was truly the future he had envisioned for us. Colonel Harold Moore.
Jet aircraft were used with devastating effectiveness in Vietnam. The pilots flying the missions were in constant danger. One of those men was Colonel Fred Cherry. When he received orders to return to the States, he asked his squadron commander for more time to keep flying. His request was approved. 1 week later, while patrolling the skies over North Vietnam, he encountered fierce ground fire. His fighter jet was shot down.
I couldn't see whether I was upright, upside down, or what. I just pulled the nose up a few degrees to give me the best ejection altitude. And I prayed. Colonel Fred Cherry.
Colonel Cherry was captured and imprisoned along with hundreds of other Americans in North Vietnam's notorious Hanoi Hilton. The crash had badly injured his shoulder and wrist, which were not treated until 4 months after his arrival. His captors used no anesthetic.
It was the worst straight pain I had yet known. They had my face covered with the sheet, and they kept raising it to see if I'm going to beg for mercy, going to scream. And each time they looked down at me, I would look up at them and smile. They kept at it for 3 hours, and I kept thinking, I can take it.
Like many of his fellow POWs, Colonel Cherry was tortured regularly. His tormentors wanted him to denounce the U.S. government and tell other blacks that they should not be fighting for a country that didn't care about them. The officer refused.
If they are going to kill me, they are going to have to kill me. I'm not going to denounce my government or shame my people. Colonel Fred Cherry.
By 1967, there were almost 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. 9,378 would die that year, including Captain Riley Leroy Pitts. On October 31st, in the jungles of Ap Dong, his company was trapped and getting hammered by Viet Cong machine gun fire. Captain Pitts threw himself into the thick of it.
Captain Pitts didn't have to attack those bunkers, but he did. He was more concerned with stopping the enemy fire that was hurting us than of his own safety. Private Donald L. Hines.
As the battle raged, Captain Pitts lobbed a hand grenade at his attackers. To his horror, it bounced back. The soldier threw his body over the bomb, which failed to explode. After a moment's pause, Captain Pitts returned to the fray, fighting valiantly until he was mortally wounded by a rocket-propelled grenade. It was supposed to have been his last day in Vietnam. Captain Riley Leroy Pitts would become the first black officer in American history to receive the Medal of Honor.
What this man did in an hour of incredible courage will live in the history of America as long as America endures. His valor under fire moved him forever into that select company where the heroes of our history stand. President Lyndon Johnson.
The fighting in Southeast Asia continued to escalate. In early 1968, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army took advantage of Buddhist New Year celebrations and launched the Tet Offensive by attacking Saigon. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the war, and African-American medics were in the thick of it.
The casualties just kept coming in, and they didn't stop. It was like something that we'd never seen before. We had the helicopters coming in, we had the ambulances coming in. They were just coming in from everywhere. We just looked up there and the helicopters almost blocked out the sun. That's how many of them were coming in. Medic Kerry Spearman.
Medical duty in Vietnam was dangerous work, and in many of the frontline military hospitals, African-American nurses ministered to wounded soldiers.
I had to go to Vietnam. I needed to go. Captain Elizabeth Allen.
Captain Allen was assigned to the 71st Evacuation Hospital, which was bombed during the Tet Offensive.
Men's lives were dependent on me, and my being scared was just not useful. You had these guys with massive wounds, not just a leg cut off, but as bad as 2 legs off, 2 arms off, and blind. I had to protect him. I had to make sure if a mortar hit, the shrapnel didn't hit him again. I had to keep them alive to the best of my ability. I sat on a razor's edge. Captain Elizabeth Allen.
Back in the States, African-American servicemen and women had begun to receive the kind of press attention that in wars past had been unthinkable. Sergeant Clyde Brown Jr. was even featured on the cover of Time. The magazine heralded his cool professionalism and the actions of others like him.
For the first time in the nation's military history, its Negro fighting men are fully integrated in combat. Their performance in battle proclaims a truth that Americans have not yet learned about themselves. Merit is the only measure of a man. Time Magazine.
Vietnam was the first time American soldiers rode into battle aboard helicopters. Of the 41,217 chopper pilots that served in the war, 557 of them were black. One, Air Force Captain Frederick Gregory, would go on to become the first black commander of a NASA space shuttle.
I mainly flew rescue missions. I was the only African-American pilot in our group, but that was not a burden to me, because we all had the same goal of surviving each day together. But I was only able to do that because a lot of brave airmen had suffered to get us where we were. Captain Frederick Gregory.
Helicopters were the workhorses of the Vietnam War. Pilots, like Captain Ronald Radcliffe, were frequently called upon to land their aircraft in the midst of ferocious enemy gunfire.
When we got over the location, we took so much fire that I could not believe we didn't go down. I wasn't flying straight, I was making violent maneuvers to keep from getting hit. And we started shooting as we went in. We kept going back and forth shooting, killing at least 12, maybe more. I thought we gonna get killed today, and this is it. Captain Ronald Radcliffe.
As the fighting in Vietnam continued to intensify, so too did the demonstrations at home. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out.
We have been faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same school. Martin Luther King, Jr.
As in wars past, the enemy couldn't understand why black soldiers would fight so valiantly for a country that mistreated them. The Viet Cong published a pamphlet which they distributed to American troops.
Afro-Americans, in the States, you are called niggers. The Vietnamese people are not your enemy. Your enemies are those who are carrying out harsh exploitation and extremely barbarous racial discrimination against American blacks and have forced you to serve in the U.S. war of aggression against Vietnam and sow ruin and mourning for the Vietnamese people, your brothers. You cannot resign yourself to being forever second-class citizens in the United States and first-line cannon fodder in Vietnam.
On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Riots erupted in 125 American cities. Michael Herr, a reporter stationed in Southeast Asia, wrote of how the news was received in Vietnam.
The death of Martin Luther King intruded on the war in a way that no other outside event had ever done. We stood around the radio and listened to the sound of automatic weapons fire being broadcast from a number of American cities. Reporter Michael Herr.
The murder of a man whose message was nonviolence profoundly affected black soldiers fighting overseas.
When I heard that Martin Luther King was assassinated, my first
inclination was to run out and punch the first white guy I saw. All I wanted to do was to go home. I even wrote Lyndon Johnson a letter. I said that I didn't understand how I could be trying to protect foreigners in this country with the possibility of losing my life, where in my own country, people who are my heroes, like Martin Luther King, can't even walk the streets in a safe manner. Staff Sergeant Don Brown.
Race relations in the military began to reflect the rest of American society. White combat troops flew Confederate flags, and blacks raised an angry fist. A soldier, whose name was never recorded, summed up their feelings to reporter Wallace Terry.
When I'm out in the bush carrying a grenade launcher, no white man is gonna call me a nigger.
Many of the military's new draftees were urban blacks that had demonstrated for civil rights and fought in ghetto riots. In Vietnam, they banded together and called themselves Bloods. Black power was their mantra.
It was a time when James Brown had come out with "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud," and the brothers had a real sense of communion. We would tap each other on the forehead like we were given knowledge. And you couldn't walk down the street without pumping your hand in the air and showing a closed fist, showing power. That was like saying hi. Medic Wayne Smith.
When Colin Powell, now a major, returned to Southeast Asia, he found a war where the end was nowhere in sight.
Deterioration of discipline and morale was obvious. 3, 4, even 500 Americans were dying every week in 1968. The one goal was to do your time and get home alive. Major Colin Powell.
By 1972, the nation had had enough, and President Nixon announced that America was negotiating an end to the war.
This has been the longest, the most difficult war in American history. Honest and patriotic Americans have disagreed as to whether we should have become involved at all 9 years ago. President Richard Nixon.
On January 27, 1973, the United States' long nightmare came to an end. The following month, Fred Cherry and the other American POWs were on their way home.
I don't think anybody learned more about how to treat your fellow men than us guys who were there. We were all Americans, a family, and we had to survive together. Colonel Fred Cherry.
In March, the last plane load of American GIs left Vietnam and returned to a country that ignored them. For both black and white soldiers, their homecoming was painful.
No banners of well done, just confusion, anger, and rage. William King.
$7,264 African-American patriots lost their lives in Vietnam. 20 received the Medal of Honor. Their service in that terrible conflict can best be summed up by an article which appeared in Time magazine.
In the unpredictable search and destroy missions throughout the Central Highlands, in the boot-swallowing, sniper-infested mangrove swamps of the Mekong Delta, on the carrier decks and in the gun mounts of the 7th Fleet offshore, the American Negro is winning. Indeed, has won. A black badge of courage that his nation must forever honor. magazine.
With the end of the war came the end of the draft, and the military became an all-volunteer force. Uncle Sam began actively recruiting young black men and women who were motivated by job training, career advancement, and the GI Bill. In 1977, President Carter appointed Clifford Alexander as the first black Secretary of the Army. His mandate was equal opportunity, and when the review board responsible for nominating generals submitted its first list, he sent it back, noting that there were no black names on it.
My method was simple. I just told everyone that I would not sign the goddamn list unless it was fair. Clifford Alexander.
Within just a few years, there were more African American generals serving their country than ever before, including the Army's first black four-star general, Roscoe Robinson Jr., and the first black female flag officer, Brigadier General Hazel Johnson.
I'm proud to be the first black woman general. I'm very proud of that. And I'm proud for my people. Brigadier General Hazel Johnson.
In the 1980s, tensions in the Middle East began to dominate world events. Soldiers and civilians were dying in Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Israel, and Lebanon. In an effort to keep the peace, President Ronald Reagan ordered the United States Marines to Beirut.
You are about to embark on a mission of great importance to our nation and the free world. The conditions under which you carry out your vital assignment are demanding and dangerous. You are tasked to be once again what Marines have been for more than 200 years. Peacemakers. President Ronald Reagan.
In October of 1983, America took its first hit in a new and terrifyingly deadly form of warfare when the Marine headquarters in Beirut was destroyed by terrorists driving a truck packed with explosives.
I heard a ba-boom, ba-boom, and all hell broke loose. The whole place lit up like the sun. It felt like something had hit me in the head. The place had started shaking, and I rolled into the fetal position. That's the way I ended up staying. Corporal Paul Rivers.
49 of the 241 Marines who died were black. General Paul Kelly, commander of the American troops, visited the wounded.
I spoke to a young Marine with more tubes going in and out of his body than I'd ever seen in one person. He couldn't see very well. He reached up and grabbed my 4 stars just to make sure I was who I said I was. He was making signals, and we realized he wanted to tell me something. We put a pad of paper in his hand, and he wrote, "Semper Fi, always faithful." General Paul X. Kelly.
General Colin Powell, now senior military assistant to the Secretary of Defense, would one day write,
"What I saw from my perch in the Pentagon was America sticking its hand into a 1,000-year-old hornet's nest with the expectation that our mere presence may pacify the hornets." General Colin Powell.
6 years later, in recognition of his leadership and military skills, Colin Powell became the highest-ranking black officer in the history of the United States when he was appointed chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Following the ceremony, he paid tribute to all of the African-American patriots who had come before him.
This wouldn't have been possible without the sacrifices of those black soldiers who served this great nation in war for over 200 years. General Colin Powell.
General Powell believed that military action must be overwhelming and decisive in order to be successful. It was a strategy that served the world well when Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait. Within hours, the world's fourth largest army was just miles away from oil fields whose output was essential to the industrialized world. General Powell asked the question that was on everyone's mind.
Are we prepared to go forward and fight for Kuwait?
The answer was yes. Days later, U.S. fighter planes landed in Saudi Arabia, and Operation Desert Shield was underway. For the first time in its history, the United States military was fully integrated, co-ed, and following the orders of an African-American general. Vietnam-era veterans who liked to say, "The only color in the Army is green," led the all-volunteer force.
This Army of ours in the Gulf War was absolutely superb. Not perfect, but superb. It was the best Army that I ever saw. Deputy Commander Lieutenant General Calvin Waller.
In the early morning hours of January 17, 1991, the first shots were fired in what Saddam Hussein had called the mother of all battles. General Powell's plan for victory was clear.
Our strategy in going after this army is very simple. First, we're going to cut it off, and then we're going to kill it.
Iraq responded to the attacks by firing Scud missiles. 4 days into the battle, First Lieutenant Phoebe Jeter shot one down with a Patriot missile.
All around, I could hear the boom, boom, boom of other Patriot units beginning to fire. When we all started congratulating each other about the 4 Scuds the Patriots took down that night, I felt so proud. I thought to myself, I can do anything. Anything I put my mind to, I can do. First Lieutenant Phoebe Jeter.
The air war lasted 38 days. The ground war would be over in 4.
Iraq thought we were coming from the sea. They never expect us to come from where we did. We started moving at 0500. The resistance was nothing. We took a couple rounds and a few trucks were hit, but they had the casualties. Those who wanted to see Allah died. Then they started to give up. We just kept going and told them that someone in the back would pick them up. Marine Sergeant Darrington Battle.
Up to that point, only 4 Americans had died during the ground offensive. That all changed when an Iraqi missile landed on a U.S. Army barracks, killing 28 soldiers. Private Adrienne Mitchell, a black member of a non-combat Army supply unit, was one of them. Her father, a retired Air Force Chief Master Sergeant, was quoted in the media.
She was my pet, she was my baby. Her death, well, it was a fluke. God only knows why he took her. One day I'll find out. Frank Mitchell.
The next day, Arab troops liberated Kuwait City. When America's fighting men and women returned home, they were given a welcome the likes of which the nation had not seen since the end of World War II. Media coverage of their homecoming was tremendous. The March 11th issue of Life magazine declared, "Heroes all."
The celebrations were no doubt out of proportion to the achievement. Yet after the stalemate of Korea and the long agony in Southeast Asia, we had given America a clear win in a noble cause. The way I looked at it, if we got too much adulation for this one, it made up for the neglect the troops had experienced coming home from those other wars. General Colin Powell.
For the United States military, much of the 1990s was spent honoring its forgotten African-American heroes. In Concord, California, a memorial was dedicated to the 320 sailors that were killed in the Port Chicago naval disaster.
This memorial is invaluable to our community and to our country. It provides recognition to those who lost their lives in service to this country and helps our nation move beyond the racially tinged decisions that surround this tragic event in history. Congressman George Miller.
Despite countless acts of heroism during World War II, no black servicemen had yet to receive the Medal of Honor. That terrible injustice was finally rectified when 7 African Americans were recognized for their valor.
These heroes distinguish themselves in another, almost unique way. In the tradition of African Americans who have fought for our nation as far back as Bunker Hill, they were prepared to sacrifice everything for freedom, even though freedom's fullness was denied to them. President Bill Clinton.
The honorees included Private George Watson, who gave his life rescuing soldiers aboard the Dutch steamer Jacob when it was attacked by Japanese bombers. First Lieutenant John Fox was killed the day after Christmas, stopping a Nazi advance in Italy. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was recognized for leading the way in France. Major Charles Thomas stormed a village 5 miles from the German border. He later remarked, "I was sent to draw enemy fire, but I didn't mean to draw that much." Staff Sergeant Edward Carter, despite being shot 5 times, managed to kill 6 of his attackers and capture the other 2 before returning to his unit. Private First Class Willie James lost his life trying to save his wounded platoon leader. Second Lieutenant Vernon J. Baker destroyed multiple German positions, then covered the evacuation of his company's wounded by drawing the enemy's bullets. He was the only man who lived long enough to attend the ceremony.
As a black soldier, I fought a war on 2 sides. I was an angry young man, and all my soldiers were angry. But we had a job to do, and we did it. Medal of Honor recipient, Vernon Baker.
As the world rang in the 21st century, a global millennium celebration seemed to provide people of all races, faiths, and traditions with hope for the future. Yet, in remote Middle Eastern hideouts, terrorists were plotting America's destruction. Back in 1998, suicide bombers had blown up the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. Their next target was the USS Cole. Of the 17 sailors who lost their lives in the attack, 6 were African Americans, and 2 of those were women.
My heart ached as I thought of the families. Children who won't have a daddy home for Christmas. Mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, fiancés, and friends. All left behind as these 17 take their final tour of duty to a port we call heaven. Sailors, we salute you on your journey home. USS Cole Memorial website.
On the morning of September 11th, 2001, the terrorists came to America. 4 commercial airliners were hijacked and used to destroy the United States' international symbols of wealth and power. As a horrified nation watched on television, smoke poured from the Pentagon, and the twin towers of the World Trade Center collapsed in a smoldering pile of twisted steel.
We saw the second plane crash, and we got permission to take off, heading toward New York. I actually saw the towers fall. All you could see was smoke. It was a dust pile. That's all we could see. Major Anthony LaSure.
The world was stunned. Colin Powell, who was now the nation's first African-American Secretary of State, spoke for freedom-loving people everywhere when he said,
"They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy." Secretary of State Colin Powell.
America declared war on the terrorists who had ruthlessly murdered 2,973 people.
To the men and women in our military, every sailor, every soldier, every airman, every Coast Guardsman, every Marine, I say this: your mission is defined. The objectives are clear. Your goal is just. We will not waver, we will not falter, and we will not fail. President George W. Bush.
Aboard the USS Enterprise, a sailor, whose name was never recorded, expressed the sentiments of all his shipmates when he said,
"Our role is to protect America. And that is what we're going to do."
In less than 2 months, American Marines had established a base in Afghanistan. They were kept resupplied and refueled by KC-130 transports. The men and women flying some of the planes made regular runs from bases in Pakistan. When one of the aircraft went down, 7 Marines lost their lives, including the war's first African-American casualties, Sergeant Jeanette Winters and Gunnery Sergeant Stephen Bryson. In a final Christmas card home, Stephen had written,
"Hi, Mom. I'm sure you know by now that I won't be home for Christmas. But I wanted to make sure you got this card from me. I miss you and hope everything is well. Have a wonderful holiday season and don't worry about me. I'm fine. Love, Stephen."
As the United States gained a foothold in Afghanistan, the war on terror spilled into Iraq. Despite protests at home and abroad, American servicemen and women were soon marching towards Baghdad. For the first time in history, the world was able to watch the conflict unfold in real time, courtesy of satellite video phones and journalists embedded in frontline units. One of the Marines that television viewers got to know was First Sergeant Edward Smith, a seemingly indestructible family man who was about to retire and to become a cop when he was needed in Iraq. As his unit headed to the front, he sent a short message to his buddies in the Anaheim Police Department.
Things are going well here in Central Iraq. I'm doing fine. The Marines are staying the course. Tell everyone that I said hello. I'm taking a SWAT team ball cap all the way to Baghdad. If you can send me a small flag, I'll fly it in Iraq. Stay safe. Smitty.
Shortly before his men were due to enter Baghdad, First Sergeant Ed Smith was killed in action. The attack was captured on network television, and his death sparked a nationwide outpouring of sympathy.
First Sergeant Smith, you are a true American hero. One day we will meet, because I know that Marines stand guard at Heaven's Gate. Gary Decker, Petersburg, Virginia.
At least thy right shall guard one place.
Baghdad fell to American forces in a matter of days, but the long and bloody battle for Iraq had just begun. As American troops settled in for the long haul, Lieutenant Colonel Reginald Allen assumed command of the 1st Squadron, 10th Cavalry, also known as the Buffalo Soldiers. He was the first black officer in the unit's 138-year history to ever lead the men into combat.
The incredible thing about the Buffalo Soldiers, especially those who served early on, is that they love this country enough that through the racism, through the bigotry, they still wanted to serve. They served with pride and honor and professionalism. That is absolutely no different than what the Buffalo Soldiers today are doing. We'll do it as best we can, as long as we can, until it is time for us to go home to our families. Lieutenant Colonel Reginald Allen.
God bless America.
American servicemen and women were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan when back home, the American people elected their 44th president. On a cold winter morning, with 1.8 million people in attendance, Barack Obama placed his hand on Abraham Lincoln's Bible and repeated the oath of office.
So help me God.
With those words, the United States of America had its first black commander-in-chief.
The time has come to reaffirm our enduring spirit, to choose our better history, to carry forward that precious gift, that noble idea passed on from generation to generation, the God-given promise that all are equal, all are free, and all deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
The story of America's black patriots is a paradox. Since 1641, there has never been a time in our history when African Americans were unwilling to serve and bravely sacrifice for their country. Yet, despite this valiant heritage, until recently, no matter the conflict, whenever America was engaged in war, the question, would the Negro fight, was raised in numerous ways, and always with the same racist assumptions. African Americans were inferior. They couldn't be trusted with a gun. They didn't have the intelligence or the courage to fight. They wouldn't follow orders, let alone ever be capable of giving them.
As history has vividly demonstrated, what ultimately needed to be asked wasn't would the Negro fight, but rather why. As African American servicemen and women continue to shed their blood in the defense of the United States, the answer to that question is abundantly clear. Like all Americans in all wars, African Americans fought for love of liberty.
Tell me, weary soldier, from the rude and stirring wars, was my brother in the battle where you gained those noble scars? He was ever brave and valiant, and I know he never fled. Was his name among the wounded or numbered with the dead? Was my brother in the battle when the tide of war ran high? You would know him in a moment by his dark and flashing eyes. Tell me, weary soldier, will he never come again? Did he suffer with the wounded or die among the slain? Was my brother in the battle when the noble Highland hosts were so wrongfully outnumbered on the Carolina coast? Did he struggle for the Union mid the thunder and the rain till he fell among the brave on the bleak Virginia plain? I'm sure that he was dauntless and his courage ne'er would lag by contending for the honor of our dear and cherished flag. Tell me, weary soldier, will he never come again? Did he suffer with the wounded or die among the slain? Was my brother in the battle when the flag of Erin came to the rescue of our banner and protection of our fame? While the fleet from off the waters poured out terror and dismay, till the bold and erring foe fell like leaves on autumn day. When the bugle called to battle and the cannon deeply roared, oh, I wish I could have seen him draw his sharp and glittering sword. Tell me, weary soldier, will he never come again? Did he suffer 'neath the wound die.